Okay, everybody. Well, welcome to this afternoon's talk. It gives me great pleasure to introduce my friend and sometime co-writer, David Block. David is ICREA Research Professor in Sociolinguistics, currently based at the University of Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona. And of course, David also has a long association with the IOE. I mean, he, I think, started work at the IOE in 1996.
96, yeah.
Was professor of languages and education there from 2008 until 2012. And you'll all be very familiar with his many publications. I mean, David's written about SLA, he's written about identity, multilingualism, neoliberalism and applied linguistics, social class and applied linguistics, political economy and sociolinguistics, and post-truth. But today he's going to talk about intersectionality, and you can see there the title of his talk, Intersectionality, A Critical Journey Through Roots and Roots. So I'm going to hand over to David now in a second. David will talk for about 45, 50 minutes, and that will then leave us some time for questions and discussion at the end. If you want, you can use the chat facility throughout David's talk, and I'll just keep an eye on it so that at the end, I can field some questions from the chat directly after David stops speaking. All right, David, I'll hand over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, John, and thank you to everyone for coming today, I will say. I'll start off with, wait a second. Right. I just wanted to say a couple of things before I start. There are a couple of them listed here. In fact, something I've thought for some time about, we need to be wary about terminology that we use. And because it sort of takes on a life of its own in very many cases. And you can think about any number of sort of terms that are out there floating around. And it occurs to me that within the claims we all make about working in an interdisciplinary way, that there's really a need to historicize in any constructs, concepts, terms that we use. You know, conducting maybe archaeologies, looking at historical developments. So that's really what today's talk is about, particularly the first probably 2/3 of it. Of course, with all this sort of thing, we need to avoid getting carried away, which is really what's happened to me, because I'm writing a book on kind of an update of views on identity, and I hope to include a part on intersectionality, and I started reading and writing, and particularly in the area of what would be termed Black feminism. And for the past year, I've been on this kind of wild reading program, which has taken me back to the 19th century and just writing and writing and writing, and sort of ended up just writing the whole story of Black feminism and how we eventually get to intersectionality, which has proven to be very rewarding and very interesting for me personally, but it's also been fairly useless for the purposes of writing the book I'm writing. And in fact, I've even to a point where I probably won't even include any of this in the book, and I'll have to just look to do something else with it. So with all this kind of thinking about this, I've taken on the task of giving a talk on intersectionality today. But in any case, what I thought would be important is to start at the beginning and to bring in just a kind of snapshot of some of the things I've been reading and some of the things I've discovered. Now, intersectionality is a sort of big business now. There are lots of books that have come out on the topic. In 2016 alone, there were books by Jennifer Nash, Anja Marie Hancock, and also Patricia Hill Collins and Surma Bilge. And you can see those books sort of down the middle of the screen. The book on the left at the bottom, Intersectionality, Patricia Hill Collins, The Critical Theory, Social Theory, is a 2019 book. And more recently, there's a book, 2021, by Kimberle Crenshaw, who's credited with having coined the term in 1989. There's lots more than this out there, and there are loads of articles, special issues in journals. And I've just been kind of wading my way through this material, and of course, then doing spin-off readings, as I mentioned earlier, going back in time. Definition, there are lots of definitions. A fairly clear and easy to present one is in the Collins and Bilge book. And this is intersectionality as a way of understanding, hold on a second, I need to get rid of something. I've got the, no, okay. Okay, sorry. I had something on the right-hand side of my screen I was trying to get rid of. So intersect has a way of understanding, analyzing the complexity of the world and people and human experiences. The events and conditions of social and political life and the self can seldom be understood as shaped by one factor. They are generally shaped by many factors. And I think this kind of multiplicity of factors is obviously a foundational idea in intersectionality. When it comes to social inequality, people's lives and the organization of power in a given society are better understood as being shaped not by a single axis, such as race, gender, class, dealt with individually, but as many axes working together. This thing about working together also is interesting. We can maybe come back to this at the end, is how does that actually work? It's very easy to say that all these different forms of oppression and exploitation occur simultaneously and that they overlap and that they feed off of each other. But exactly how, we might say that, but how that actually works is a question that's kind of up in the air in a lot of the things I'm reading. And of course, intersectionality as an analytical tool, right? Now, Crenshaw, I mentioned earlier, and in 1989, and then again in 1991, she wrote 2 articles that are seen as kind of foundational to intersectionality studies. The 1989 article, she was actually commenting on her experience in the legal profession as a lawyer, working on cases of discrimination cases and working with Black women, and the kind of led her to believe and to see how the judicial system worked against these women on racial grounds and also in terms of gender. And so she talks in this particular quote about the multidimensionality, which I've already mentioned, of oppressions, how a single axis approach doesn't really work. You start isolating people as, for example, along racial lines or along gender lines, but don't put it together. How far can you get with that sort of analysis? And this idea of this multiply burdened people, this kind of notion gets marginalized if you use a single axis approach. Now, when I started, as I said at the very beginning, when I started looking into intersectionality, I was reading in the present, right? So I was reading material from the last 10 years. But of course, in all of the literature you read, you end up getting references backward, if you like. And so there's a lot of reference back to the beginnings. Where did intersectionality begin? Not in name, but perhaps in deed. Okay, so what would be sort of de facto intersectionality before it was actually called that, if you like. This is an exercise we can do with a lot of terminology. In fact, something starts getting, some sort of set of phenomena start getting called something at a particular point, but obviously people were talking about these things before. They were just using different terminology or framing the discussion in a different way. And Catherine Gines, who now calls herself Catherine Sophia Bell, there's a long story there. You can look it up on internet. But from 2017, she changed her name. She writes in 2014 about proto-intersectionality. And this is to capture this idea that in early Black feminism, going back into the 19th century and well into the 19th century, we have instances, we have speeches, we have written pieces, we even have novels, we have memoirs, we have all kinds of literature. A lot of this literature has been discovered only in the past 20 years and been published. So you have publications from 10 years ago, which is actually something that was never published when it was written 150 years ago. So what she's looking at in this proto-intersectionality is that there were cases of people who were denouncing racism and sexism, and particularly the confluence of the two that Black women had to deal with, right? So we have going back into times of slavery and then moving forward, abolition of slavery, and then into the end of the 19th century. And that particular period of time was very rich if you start looking at the history. Another concept that applies to what I'll be looking at is the concept of race women, which is used by Brittany Cooper. This was originally used by Pauline Hawthorne, who was an activist and who coined it in 1902, which she talked about true race women. And these were Black women. Again, all of the story I'm telling so far is in the United States. So that needs to be, I think it's fairly obvious by now, but it needs to be clear. So we're looking at intersectionality as arising out of particular social conditions economic conditions, et cetera, in the United States from the 19th century onwards. So Brittany Cooper talks about a group of women, and she classifies them as the first Black women intellectuals, people who entered into public racial leadership roles, explicitly fashioned themselves as a public duty to serve their people, the task to study and discuss all phases of the race question. Not only institution builders and activists, they also declared themselves public thinkers on race questions, and they were at the forefront of debates over the woman question and the role of Black women in public life through the 1800s, right? So again, and very often you have these multiple roles of being abolitionists and also being feminists, suffragettes, and then also apart from abolitionism, there's also just more generally racism in society, because you also had people who were living as in freedom, if you like, say in the northern part of the United States, but also suffering from racism. Now, some of the early race women, possibly the earliest example that's often cited is Maria Stewart, who's classified by some as the first American, Black or white, first American-born woman to have lectured in public. And she had a very short career, around 1830, 1832, speaking in abolitionist fora. And she was actually marginalized as a woman by abolitionists. And also, again, there was also discrimination against her as a Black person and as a Black woman and as a woman. So she had all of these things coming together. And she had a very short career, 2 or 3 years. But she did work as an educationalist, and she all her life was sort of fighting the fight, if you like, and particularly making the point that just because a woman is Black does not mean she's condemned to only working in the kitchen or working in the fields, if you like. Harriet Jacobs is a perhaps better known figure simply because of the memoir that she wrote, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, which was written in 1861 and then published at that time, and then really discovered in the last 20 to 30 years, and is often discussed in literature on intersectionality. Not sure what I did with her birth date and her death. Not that 5 got stuck in there anyway. By the way, if you look at the years I'm putting up here, you will see the longevity of all of these women. Most of them lived into their 80s, if you like, which is a very kind of interesting sort of side issue, I think. But Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl is a fascinating story because it's about Harriet Jacobs as a house slave, if you like, but then at the age of 15, having her master, who wasn't really her master, was a doctor whose daughter was theoretically her master, but she was only 4 years old or something. So again, this man turning his attention to, he was in his 50s at the time, and she writes of her experience of being pursued by this man who wanted to set up a house for her. So she, and again, this goes back to the whole issue of rape as part of slavery, and again, what she had to do to deal with this. And so how she went through her life avoiding this man, and eventually became free, and then worked as an activist in her own right in her latter years. Frances Harper was an author, poet, also wrote a novel called Lola Leroy, which is considered one of the early novels. And again, this talked about the experience of being a free Black woman, but not really free, and suffering, again, all of the intersectional, if you like, discriminations that she would have suffered. Sojourner Truth is very well known for this, a speech that she purportedly gave called Ain't I a Woman? She did give the speech probably pretty obviously, but the question is whether she actually uttered the words Ain't I a Woman in the speech. And I say that because there's literature suggesting that the transcription that you see in a lot of publications shows her speaking what some call slave dialect. And she's very compellingly making the case, that I am a woman, I'm a Black woman. And so why can't I be treated like a woman, like a white woman? Or why am I a victim both of sexism and of racism, if you like? And the interesting thing is the message, there are alternative transcriptions of this, but the transcription that's used the most was actually constructed 12 years after the fact. And and perhaps even strategically. Truth herself was a Dutch speaker until the age of 8, and then was exposed to English, but all of this in the city of New York and in that area. And so the question of whether she would have spoken as she was presented in the speech. But the speech, again, is important because whether it actually really happened that way or she really said those words, the message was there. And this is part of sort of the sort of background, if you like, to intersectionality. Later race women were people like Anna Julia Cooper, Ida Wells, and Mary Church Terrell. Mary Church Terrell was actually born into one of the wealthiest Black families in the United States. All of these women were well educated, particularly Cooper and Terrell. And Ida Wells was actually an investigative journalist, and she denounced the horrors of lynching, if you like, and spent a great deal of time and energy on that. A very interesting autobiography that she wrote, and just a person who was constantly active, if you like. Anna Julia Cooper's book, A Voice from the South by a Black Woman of the South, again, is a sort of sociological study. And all of these women, again, coming back to the same theme, this kind of double or even triple jeopardy, if you like, because class issues start creeping into some of these, some of what's being written, although it's primarily the racial angle and the gender angle. Now, one of the more interesting things I've read has been a book from 2011, Sojourning for Freedom, by Eric McDuffie. And it's a fascinating book, like again, as I said, about a lot of the things I've been reading. I've just given a list here of some of the figures that he writes about in the book, and the very active role of Black women in the Communist Party in the United States, and going back a century ago. And this is a story that just isn't really told by anybody. It's sort of these things, you know, people think, first of all, they don't think about the Communist Party in the United States in the 1920s and 30s. And they don't think about things like some of these women would have gone to the Spanish Civil War. And again, just the kind of lives they left. And some of them were more hardcore communists who remained communists to their, you know, to the end of their lives. And some of them ran into an issue that you see among members of the Black community who were in the Communist Party, who became disaffected because of a lack of attention to issues around race, the particularities of being a Black American and having white American communists not being very sensitive to the racial issue and only concentrating on the economic issue. And this is kind of a constant, if you like. The Black women who remain, if you like, more loyal to the Communist Party still were very insistent about developing this racial and gender angle as well, okay? So these were all women intellectuals who were doing very, very interesting thinking, writing in most cases, and speaking and acting as activists. And in fact, Esther Cooper Jackson is still alive as we speak. Two figures I wanted to talk about. One is Louise Thompson-Patterson, because she wrote about what's called the triple exploitation. And again, once again, we're seeing how this whole issue, she talks about as workers, as women, and as Negroes, right? So she brings in these three angles, if you like. And in particular, she was concentrating on the fact of domestic workers, if you like, and trying to bring into the Communist Party in the United States the notion of domestic workers, because most of the work being done was around the factory, if you like. So what was interesting, workers of any color would be interesting working in a factory, whereas looking at domestics who were more freelance, if you like, so they're not, and they're not unionized at all. And unionizing them maybe was not seen as a possibility, were sort of marginalized among many, particularly white communists, if you like. So again, this idea that this is sort of because the bulk of Black women workers are in this type of sector, this is something that really needs to be looked at. And Claudia Jones, who has the distinction of having been actually imprisoned and deported by the US government in the 1950s because of her political activity, and ended up in London. And she was one of the founders of the Notting Hill Carnival, actually, in the 60s. And she was a very interesting story because she was an immigrant from Trinidad, and her parents were, in any case. And she arrived at the age of 9, I think, in the United States, grew up very poor, became a member of the Communist Party, and remained, again, to the end of her life, a very active member in the Communist Party. And when she did move from the United States, when she managed to when she was deported and went to London, she remained very active politically. But here she talks about, again, the whole thing, the end of the neglect of the problems of the Negro woman, and looking at, again, the particularities of so many Black women who were working as domestics. She also talks here very interestingly, and she says, in the film and the radio and the press, the Negro woman is not pictured not in a role as a breadwinner, mother, and protector of the family, but which she is, but as a mammy who takes care of the children of other families, the white families. And this traditional stereotype must be combated and rejected as the device of imperialists to perpetuate the white chauvinist ideology. So it's quite an interesting thing to be writing in 1949, I think. Already, again, with the growth of cinema, you know, you had this image being portrayed, and she was contesting that. Now, the turning point really for intersectionality, I would say, comes in the 1970s. And this is where we get much closer to the coining of the term by Crenshaw. And one of the most interesting documents produced is this Combahee River Collective statement. You have Beverly and Barbara Smith and I forgot her first name, anyway, Fraser. You see them in the photograph there. And they, again, this was put together, it's a whole collective of people, but these three women were the primary authors. And what was interesting about this was, again, was the confluence of somebody coming from a Marxist background and denouncing, again, patriarchy, imperialism. So you have sexism there, you have imperialist activity as well, which was not always commented on in some literature. And also very obviously racism. Right? And this shows, what's kind of interesting here is what they say at the midpoint: we're not convinced that a socialist revolution that is not also feminist and anti-racist will guarantee our liberation, right? So again, this constant coming through for women who were, for race women, going back to the term used earlier, who were also communists, was again this idea, yes, I'm a communist, but we need to bear in mind this, particularly the anti-racist angle, but also the feminist angle. And again, these were battles going on in the Communist Party. And again, if you look at Alexandra Kollontai, going back to the early days of the Soviet Union, again, she was in a constant battle of being a hardline communist who didn't really want to contemplate issues around feminism, and this was an ongoing kind of struggle. So again, you have these multiple dimensions kept separate, if you like. And so I think one of the interesting things about intersectionality, what we could look at, is how it's trying to bring these things together. Now, some of the interesting stuff, as I said, started the most interesting recent stuff started in the 70s. And this is four books, 4 women and 4 books from the 1980s. Sorry about that. Sorry you had to see that. Anyway, so you have here Bell Hooks' book, Ain't I a Woman, which again takes the Sojourner Truth line from the speech as kind of a starting point. And this is a book that talks a lot about the feminist movement and how this kind of division between sort of white middle-class feminism and indeed just middle-class feminism, and then working-class feminism, which is marginalized, and particularly Black working-class feminism, which is marginalized. Angela Davis's book, again, the starting point as a Marxist and moving into issues around race and gender. And Pauli Murray's book, which is an autobiography, perhaps less known than the other 2 books. And then there's the Black Feminist Thought, the book from 1990, which is seen as many people as a definite turning point, and it kind of laying out in some 300 pages a massive amount of material as kind of a foundational to how we might see Black feminist thought towards the end of the last century. Now, I'm taken by this comment from Davis's book, when she talks about working women have a special and vital interest in the struggle for socialism under capitalism, campaigns for jobs on equal basis with men, combined with movements for institutions such as subsidized public child care, continue to have, oh, I got something left out here, sorry, an explosive revolutionary potential. The strategy calls into question the validity of monopoly capitalism most ultimately point in the direction of socialism. So you see, what's interesting about this is she doesn't mention race, but of course she does in the book bring in race quite a bit, but you can always see throughout the book this sort of three coming together, which you see in the title. So you have, again, combating racism, economic exploitation, and sexism. I wanted to mention Pauli Murray because it's a fascinating case, and not one that's particularly well known, but she actually coined the term. She called it Jane Crow. She captured the links between racism and sexism in the lives of Black women in the US. So of course, Jim Crow referred to legislation and practices, particularly in the Southern United States, against the rights of African Americans. And she, again, was adding in there that women were suffering this sort of double from Black men and white men, if you like. She had a very interesting professional trajectory as well, working in a variety of capacities, ending up being an ordained Episcopal priest at the age of 67. But interestingly, she was unable to engage explicitly with her probable lesbianism. And I say this, and also androgyny and possible even trans identity as we would understand it today. And there's some interesting literature you see listed, some authors there who have written about this, because in her autobiography, she doesn't really go into those details very much, although there's a lot of sort of suggestive comments about the sort of her relationships with women. She also, the last item here, she had a close relation with Eleanor Roosevelt, and apparently had her ear, she met with her on occasion and also had a long correspondence with her by letter. And that started in 1938. So again, it's a kind of interesting case here because getting away from, Angela Davis is the communist element is very important. With Pauli Murray, that wasn't an element at all. But again, bringing in other issues, and also the hint of bringing in discrimination around lesbianism and also the trans side as well, which she suffered in her lifetime, but she did not explicitly engage with what to do about it. Collins' book, as I said, is considered really kind of a turning point. And in 2000, she published the second edition of that. And then, as I said, more recently, she's published in 2019, another update on intersectionality. So she's definitely a kind of a scholar to go to on this particular topic. This is from an article by Alenia in which she outlines what maybe are 5 key elements in the book about, first of all, that what she lays out here is an African-American women are oppressed by power structures. And something that was introduced in 1990, although Collins is not so much insisting on this particular term anymore, although she's talking about the same thing, what she called a matrix of domination based on racism, sexism, class struggle, heteronormativity, and nationalism. And we could even add a few others to that. A collective African-American woman identity emergent in the dialectic of oppression and resistance to it. Same dimension necessarily impact individual African-American in different ways. So again, looking at intra-categorical diversity, I'll come back to that in a moment. Notwithstanding this intergroup diversity, there's an emergent common political identity. And finally, Black business thought must necessarily impact feminism more broadly in social theory as well. So again, trying to situate Black feminist thought. One thing that Collins looked at more recently is she's gone back and looked at the Frankfurt School critical theory and sort of trying to articulate, this is in her 2019 book, the ideas around intersectionality, in, how do they articulate with these different traditions, if you like. Where it stands today, I think we can talk about 3 key elements here. The first is the applications of intersectional framework to investigations. Or to research, I should say. But there's also kind of a meta level going on. There's a lot of debate about the scope and the content of intersectionality. And then finally, it has always been about activism. And this is a very important point because the proto-intersectionality I was looking at earlier, all of the women I mentioned were first and foremost activists, what would be understood today as activists. And this has continued to this day. Although not all of the authors I've cited have been to varying degrees activists in their day-to-day lives, right? So there is space for somebody sort of working the more academic angle, if you like, the angle of ideas. But Collins certainly makes clear in her work that it's a very important side to things. So it's sort of in practice, if you like. This is from 2019, the Collins book. And again, this is sort of laying out the core constructs and guiding premises. And so relationality is a very important concept. This is an important concept if we just look at research on identity and the way that there's a great deal of relationality between different dimensions that people talk about. Power and social inequality are obviously very important issues to be examining here. Social context is important, complexity of experience and phenomena that are examined, and social justice, and this is about the sort of more practitioner side, and so where you go with any research, and indeed with any activism that takes place around intersectionality. Now, I just want to mention 3 or 4 things going on in debates about intersectionality. One thing that probably needs to be made clear is intersectionality is really not a theory of identity. It obviously draws on, if you talk about racism, you're drawing on notions around race, which might be related to identity. But it's really about what at some point Collins and other people refer to as vectors of power coming through. And I've added here as sort of structuring structures in our lives. And I related to some other work I've done on kind of looking at structure. What does structure mean with regard to agency? And so we might look at the basis of society at a very deep level: economic, political, social, and cultural. We have institutions, and then we have more socio-cultural, misspelled there, formations that emerge, if you like, out of these institutions. And all of these are kind of structured, these things structure our lives. They could act as hindrances on our activity, or they could act as facilitators. And the power running through all of this, you know, from the sort of bases through the institutions and the social formations. So that's what really intersectionality is about. And then it's defining, again, trying to define the nature of that power. And of course, the other side of this, resistance, comes through as a key concept. So we have something like this. You have like the notion of intersectionality, confluences, articulation, conjunctures. One thing that Collins does in her 2019 book is she discovered Stuart Hall rather late in the day. And so this idea of articulations and conjunctures comes from his work, where he was talking about similar sorts of discrimination, you know, processes of discrimination, if you like. So you have sort of outside, you know, more, you know, what's been looked at the most: racism, sexism, and exploitation through class. And then, of course, other dimensions that can be brought in. And all of this sort of constitutes, if you like, intersectionality. Now, I mentioned the intracategorical complexity earlier, and one author who's looked at that is McCall. And she offers up this kind of description of somebody who would bring together. Now, this is a more identity-oriented description, I would say, right? So it's just talking about different dimensions that the person embodies, right? Without getting into discrimination, oppression, or exploitation based on them, right? And I put this here for the reason of showing how everything comes together, how identity, if you like, is relational, but then how also intersectionality would be. But McCall has been, some people have found her work very interesting because she's looked a lot at the way intercategorical and intracategorical processes work in a notion like intersectionality. But she is a quantitative sociologist. And so some people have seen her work as sort of more positivist in nature, and sort of taking the notion of intersectionality and turning into something very technical, if you like. And I think here maybe she's falling into a little bit this idea of what I said earlier, sort of shifting into identity much more than intersectionality, if we understand intersectionality to be about power and resistance, as I said. One huge issue that's come up around intersectionality has been this notion of ownership, stewardship, and application. Particularly ownership and stewardship. And you know, the story I've told today, again, arising in Black feminism in the United States, is there a proprietary claim that can be made that you can only do intersectionality as a framework for analysis if you're doing it from this perspective of Black feminism? and therefore race and gender in particular and class as well. These all come together. But you cannot, for example, wouldn't be the same to look at white working class people, for example, right? So is there any kind of, sort of exclusivity, if you like, going on here? There's also accusations from Bilge, who was mentioned earlier, of in European circles of intersectionality being whitened, as she calls it. And again, people saying that it already existed in Europe, or perhaps not being sensitive to some of the sort of intricacies of the origins of intersectionality, again, in the United States, which would be in some ways natural because these people are not, from the United States. But there is kind of a conflict here, is that whether if you're going to call it intersectionality, it has to have certain characteristics, or whether you can take this metaphor and expand it in different directions, if you like. And then the idea of leadership at the bottom I have here, then, who's entrusted with care of the term. So there's a lot in the different books I mentioned at the beginning, and lots of articles and special issues, lots of discussion of these sorts of issues about who owns intersectionality and how it can be extended outward. Now, Jennifer Nash is somebody, I mentioned her book earlier. She has a book from 2019 on Black feminism and intersectionality. But already in 2008, she was writing about this idea of broadening and moving out to theorize an array of subject experience. So she's actually taking the tack that it's not just, the domain, if you like, of Black feminism. This could expand outward, if you like, as a concept, as an analytical framework. And Devin Carvalho is somebody who's written, again, from a legal profession background. He even extends even further outwards in talking about, can you do intersectionality or do intersectionality as an analytical framework in research, looking at elites and powerful people. And he's kind of taking this view, we need to have, if you're going to talk about people who are who are oppressed, who are exploited, you need to look at the people who are oppressing and exploiting them in terms of the confluence of different dimensions that come together in their lives and how their power is constructed intersectionally. And on the other hand, how the oppression and exploitation is. So that's an interesting idea, I think. There's the, what we might call the bigger picture and smaller picture issue coming up here. The focus on particular arrangements, race or class or gender, there's always this issue of maybe you do have to isolate these constructs in order to intersect them, if you like. And this is, like you need categories that are relatively fixed in order to then look in an intercategorical way. So this is an issue, and also whether you're just adding up, you're just starting with race and then adding class and adding these things on there, or you're actually getting to the heart of everything coming together, this kind of everything's threaded together. However, this is something that Collins wrote in 1993, but if you look at the bottom in 2019, she wrote, systems of power may be theoretically intersectional, yet in practice, some forms of oppression will be especially salient during particular periods of time and particular social context. So here she seems to be saying that, well, yes, all this, all these different dimensions exist, but maybe one of them is more salient, if you like. And this is something that I've thought about over the last few years, is that, is there even a starting point that somebody really, there's one particular type of oppression, for example, that somebody's interested in, such as racism, and that everything else kind of flows through that, if you like, if that makes sense. We can talk about matters in that way. I just wanted to show you a story, though, from Crenshaw in 1989 that she included in her article, where she was coining intersectionality. And this talks about her experience when she was in her younger days. She was in her first year at law school. And she talks about going out with two friends, both of whom were Black men. And she'd formed a study group with them. And one of them was a graduate from Harvard College, often told us stories about a prestigious and exclusive men's club that boasted memberships of several past presidents and other influential white males. He was one of its very few Black members. To celebrate completing our first year exams, our friend invited us to join him at the club for drinks. Anxious to see this fabled place, we approached the large door, grasped the brass door ring to announce our arrival. But our grand entrance was cut short when our friend sheepishly slipped from behind the door and whispered that he had forgotten a very important detail. My companion and I bristled, our training as Black people having taught us to expect yet another barrier to our inclusion, even an informal one Black person. So it'd be okay to accept one Black person, but since there were 3 of them, they couldn't allow them in. The tension broke, however, when we learned that we were being excluded, not because of our race, but because I would have to go around to the back door because I was a female. So it was an all men's club. I entertained the idea of making a scene to dramatize the fact that my humiliation as a female was no less painful and my exclusion no more excusable than had we all been sent to the back door because we were Black. But sensing no general assent to this proposition, also being of the mind that due to our race, a scene would in some way jeopardize all of us, I failed to stand my ground. After all, the club was about to entertain its first Black guest, even though we would have to enter through the back door. Right? So again, this is a very interesting story, I think, for showing how, in this case, for example, she sort of prioritized the racial side. You know, fortunately, it wasn't the racial side, and was almost accepting for the conditions that she mentioned. This gender bias, if you like, momentarily. Now, I'd just like to move to just a few examples, which are probably will make my point to some extent. I don't think they're the best examples in the world, and just 3 of them really. This is from data that I've been involved in the collection of, but also worked primarily with other people's data. In the case of Victor Corona, who you see on the right, we collaborated on several articles. And one common thread in some of the stuff we worked on is what we might call the other Catalans. So these are working class minority ethnic students in secondary school and higher education. And so again, this is a look at, say, children of immigrants, if you like, and Lidia Gallego is somebody else I've worked with. And so we have a kind of base of a lot of material we haven't even written about, although it's been sitting there for a long time. But I just wanted to share with you just a few things and think about them in terms of some of the concepts around intersectionality that I've mentioned so far. Before I start, though, I wanted to, sorry, I forgot I put this slide in. That's why I was looking a little bit surprised there. In my 2014 book on social class, I do mention intersectionality briefly. And by the way, I would say that my previous work where I mentioned intersectionality, I think I would not write about it in the way I would write now, because I think I've done considerable more reading. And I think I have at least for me, a better understanding of what's going on when we talk about intersectionality. But in any case, I did write this, which I would stick by. And this was, in the midst of a short discussion of intersectionality with regard to class. And again, what I say here is understanding the discrimination and marginalization, that it's just an example of a 30-year-old female immigrant from Ecuador living in, we could say, Barcelona, Catalonia, Spain. Means taking account a series of overlapping and interlinked dimensions, right? This is my wording at that time. I might express it in a different way today. So we look at it in class terms. She's positioned as a lower class person doing low-level service jobs like cleaning. Her institution's social status as an immigrant makes her increasingly unwelcome as economic crises deepen. I put crises in plural because we seem to be in a time of multiple crises. She is a person of color, a visible minority with an Andean appearance and physical features not valued in mainstream society. She is culturally different with a worldview and behaviors which are not considered Catalan or even Spanish. She does not speak Catalan. She is immersed in gender regimes in her home life with her Ecuadorian husband and in mainstream Catalan society. These are differentiable, but in both cases work against her. So again, you have sort of a range of oppressive regimes, if you like, that are at the same time impacting on her life. Now, how does that work? Well, this is a very interesting piece of data that, that Victor and I published in a 2016 piece, which was actually on intersectionality. One moment, I need to get some water. And this is, you can see the original, the person was speaking Spanish, and then on the right you have the poem. But anyway, it talks about my mother. She's talking to her mother, and her mother works as a cleaner, right? So that when she first arrived, she had to scrub floors in Spanish house, but in Spanish house, she couldn't eat until the Spanish finished. As her bosses finished eating, she couldn't eat because they said that maids, and she repeats maids, ate after the bosses. So my mother also told me she came here and that they humiliate her a lot, but now no longer. She tells me now that I humiliate the Spanish since they need me. Now, clarifying exactly what that means, I don't have the information, but again, you see this kind of this, I would call this the unhidden injuries of class, right? Using, you know, the Sennett and Cobb term, the hidden injuries of class. This is actually very clearly coming through. And again, we can see what this person is subject to is what I was just mentioning before, is kind of this multidimensionality of being an immigrant, being from a particular background, from Ecuador, and being, again, this particular class position, and et cetera, and everything kind of comes down on her, if you like, in the same time. Another way you might look at how religious bias, race, gender, and language come together. And this is from an informant called Laila that Lydia Gallego interviewed in 2015, and she and I discussed on different occasions. And so she talks about, one day I was at the post office and this lady came out and she was nearly the last to come out. And outside she started saying, you know what, the one wearing the scarf, if she had taken any more time, I swear that, I don't know, laughing. She thought I didn't speak Catalan because she said it right in front of me. She thought I didn't understand Catalan because I was wearing a scarf. And I finished listening to the conversation and then said, well, good afternoon. And she was stunned. She turned really red and said, just because you see me like this, you think I don't know Catalan. So again, this is a interesting kind of the way that she's othered for physical appearance. And there's a racial element here, and there's also the religious element and the manifestation of that through the scarf. But again, as a young woman who's not conforming to what a young woman should wear, if you like, not wear a scarf, if you like, and the way she should be, if you like, and also the language issue as well, because again, the dynamics of Catalan, and Catalan being a language that, as I've written about on occasion, this idea that if you look different, people, it's considered much more an insider language, even though it's in many circles, it's a dominant language inside of Catalonia. It's a language of education, for example. So again, to assume you see somebody who's dark skinned and you say, they assume they don't speak Catalan. So if you're a Black person living here, you might go through your whole life as you speak Catalan perfectly well and people constantly addressing you in Spanish, right? Which is a way of othering you as not being quite Catalan, if you like. The third example I was going to mention, and again, it has very similar elements to what we've just seen. Very interesting author, Najat Al-Hachmi, who is from a small city called Bilge in sort of north of Barcelona. And she wrote a very interesting book in 2004 called I Am Also Catalan. And she's an interesting case because she was 8 years old, arrived from Morocco with her parents in Bilge, and proceeded then end up in university and studied Catalan language. And she's now become a fairly well-known author in Catalan and written several books by now. But she talks about sorry, I've got to go back. I'm being very clumsy here. Wait a second. Sorry. But in this book, she writes about her experiences coming from the background that she came from. And many of these have to do with language, that her command of Catalan, she at some point realized that she was just very interested in language, and she was already writing, when she was a teenager. And so she comes into conflict with it because she's not considered a legitimate, if you like. She can speak, with some people she can speak in Catalan, but she's not considered quite Catalan enough, if you like. And so here we have a couple of cases. This is a friend of hers, an older woman she was working with. And so the person says, on the left, you have the conversation in Catalan, on the right in English. So she says, I have to go by incens. And incens is sort of it doesn't exist in Catalan as incens. That's using a Spanish form, if you like, and turning it into a Catalan word. So being a purist, Najat says, you must mean incens, and she corrects her, right? And so the woman says, no, it's incens. And so they go back and forth. And so what she says is what we say normally because of the influence of Spanish. So she's being a linguist here, if you like, but very much a prescriptive linguist. And so she said, yeah, right, you're going to tell me a Catalan. If you like, I can bring you a dictionary. And he said, don't bother. All my life I've said incens, and you're not going to come along, a foreigner, to tell me how I speak my language. So again, suddenly she turns on her, you know, they're friends, but she turns on her when she crosses this line. And so again, you know, before this moment, they're friends, but suddenly everything comes back. You know, you are from Morocco, you're not from here. You're not going to tell me, you know, how to speak my language, if you like. And a similar one, well, a similar one, no, sorry, different one, but again, you get this kind of, I mean, these are also examples I've used in other publications of sort of microaggressions, you know, racist microaggressions, if you like. But here we get this case of, she walks into a shop, and she'd earlier phoned before a job, you know, there was a job going, and so she phoned. So she walks into the shop, and the woman behind the counter sees her and says in Spanish, she sees her. So she sees this woman with this physical appearance that she has. It doesn't look local to her. And she says in Spanish, "What do you want?" Right? And so Najat says, "I'm here for the job. We spoke on the phone earlier," but she speaks in Catalan. And so then the woman does speak in Catalan. She says, "Oh, it's you." She says, "Yes, it's me." "Well, I'll let you know. And why did you make me come in to see your face?" Right? This is perhaps not so microaggression, in fact, very obvious, pretty much in your face, if you like, no pun intended. And so this is, again, another case of these oppressive regimes coming through, if you like, so being imposed on her. Particularly the two cases I'm looking at here with Najat are much more around racism, if you like, right? The previous one, again, added in the religious element, if you like. So as I said, these are not the best examples, but it's sort of a way of starting to think about applications, if you like, of intersectionality. There are a lot better ones out there in a lot of the research that's growing. To be honest, my interest today, as you probably noticed, is fall much more on the theoretical side, and also this sort of provenance of the ideas that now are seen as foundational to what intersectionality is about. And in fact, my plan now is to sort of work on some of the material I've been writing in a somewhat undisciplined way, if I can bring it together into some form. But I suppose to conclude, I would say, do we need intersectionality? I mean, do we need the term itself? I think we need the sort of ideas I've been talking about as a more refined way of analyzing oppression and exploitation in society. But I think this kind of, the issue I mentioned earlier that I would come back to is this how this all comes together, this idea that this, you know, these are simultaneous oppressions, but how do you sort of write that up? How do you, and how do you actually do the analysis where you're really showing how these things come together? And again, this goes back to, there's a long line of scholars who've looked at, you know, from a Marxist perspective, but how would you bring in issues around racism, for example, and gender? And as I said, there's been a problem, I think, in particularly in terms of communist parties over the past century or so, dealing with this confluence of oppressions, if you like, and from the side of intersectionality, you're seeing some Marxists who position intersectionality as being sort of anti-Marxist and anti-class, if you like, and only looking at what might be seen as more what's termed identity politics, if you like, and not looking at the political economic side, particularly from a Marxist perspective. So there's a lot out there being discussed, and I think there's I would say that most of the literature I read that's more situates itself as this is about intersectionality does not really deal with class that much, if you like. It's certainly not in an explicit way. And I say not in an explicit way, it might be mentioned in passing. Obviously, people like Angela Davis know. I mean, she was always writing about class, if you like. But Patricia Hill Collins, perhaps more, she does have class in her analysis, but perhaps certainly much less than somebody like Angela Davis, right? So I could go on around these issues, but I think I'll stop there, and we can go to questions, which I'm sure you probably have. So thank you very much.
Thank you, David, for that. There are quite a few questions or comments in the chat room, so I'll just go through some of these now. I'm not going to group them because they're all about different things, but I'm going to start with a comment from Barbara Barbara Meyer, and Jane Sunderland has said that Barbara's making an important point when she asks this question. Barbara asks that she says that she'd be interested to know whether you had any personal concerns about your legitimacy. I mean,
yeah.
Maybe as a white man here, or met with any resistance in researching Black feminism, and how you saw your role as cross-fertilizer of ideas. So I just could comment on that.
Yeah, a great deal, I would say. Like as I said at the beginning, I started reading sort of at a particular time and place, you know, some more recent things. These are things, well, the last few years, in fact, but certainly this is accelerating in the last year. And so then I just started, as I said, I started going back into the 19th century reading this. And I did think at one point, so who am I? I'm going to write about this. I'm going to write a book about this, you know, coming out of nowhere doing this. So I do have reservations about that. On the other hand, I think a lot depends on what I do with the material and how I actually present it and shape it. And also there is space. There is quite a bit that's come out that is giving voice to these, to the people I mentioned and many others. I've left out quite a few people, but you know, so I could add to that to sort of further give voice to this. But the other thing is how you know, how I would deal with, you know, some more recently the Marxist perspective I've taken and how I am going to integrate the notion of intersectionality into that. So I could kind of think of two things. One would be to look at the whole issue of Black feminism and maybe bring it forward, you know, saying, well, this really needs to be looked at more. I mean, one of the things that struck me, and I think I do have a license to say this, is how, and this is not just in Black feminism. You could go back to Du Bois and you know, Frederick Douglass, and you have lots of Black male authors as well, obviously. And so you take all this literature together and what's been produced, and some of it again has gained visibility in the last 20 to 30 years, which is quite amazing, is how all of this was erased from any kind of presentation of history in the United States. And certainly when I was growing up in the 60s, you know, you didn't read an account of the Reconstruction era, you know, from well, let's say starting 1865 and maybe go 20 years forward if you like. Which of course Du Bois wrote an excellent book about that, Black Reconstruction. And so you didn't, you know, he was marginalized within historical circles, you know, as not being a proper scholar to be able to be writing this book and have it recognized by what was dominated by white historians. And so one of the things that I think I could do is to maybe go through, and from this perspective I'm presenting now, is say, look, well, this is where you're getting. You read Du Bois's book, you get American history, you get the whole thing. You're not just getting an issue around race, you're getting an entire account of what was going on politically in all sort of domains of life, if you like. So that you know, that kind of approach might be a way to go, but it is something I would be very careful about. And you know, I have thought on occasion, why am I reading? You know, who am I to be reading? You know, I'm 65 years old, white man, you know, here in Barcelona. Why am I reading these books about a slave girl who's being pursued by the slave master? I mean, you know, but I do think that, you know, what should I do? Not read these things and not think about them and not talk about them. I think it's how I present them, if you like, and what I can actually do with it, and that remains to be seen in a way. I have a few things planned, like short articles, but they would be a more like humanist journals or something like that. I wouldn't, you know, be looking to publish maybe in applied linguistics. But yes, I'm rambling here, but I have thought about that.
Barbara, would you like to comment, or Jane, would you like to comment on mute and comment on what David has just said?
Well, my comment was an immediate reaction to what you said there, David. I mean, anybody, whichever kind of identity they bore, would ever challenge anyone reading about. It was more to do with a legitimacy to speak on behalf of. I think it's I suppose I'm seeing it through the lens of my Open University work, where we always had these separate blocks, very, very fractional courses on feminism, courses on colonialism, courses on urban deprivation and social injustice, and courses on race and ethnicity. And trying to be the bridge between was a challenge, a very great challenge at that time. So I'm genuinely interested in the question, but legitimacy to read about.
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
Well, one has an obligation to read about, but to speak is more tricky.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
We're quite a white audience here. I noticed we've got some people from what we might term Middle Eastern areas, Gulf areas, and we don't seem to have any Black women present, which I think is sad. We're debating in different arenas. We're debating together still. So I'll say no more.
No, thank you.
Okay, just sort of on related to that, Fiona English has just posted a comment. She says there's been a terminological shift from race, sex, and class to race, gender, class. In feminist theory, gender is intended to refer to a tool of oppression used by patriarchy, and not, as is currently used by some, as an inner feeling, something to be aspired to. How can we be sure that we're talking about the same things when a core term is used for completely different concepts? I don't know how you feel about that, David.
Yeah. Well, the short answer would be I don't know, but I don't think that's really. Well, in a way, I mean, I don't know. I mean, what are people use the same term to mean very different things? I mean, I think that's always going to happen. I think it's a framing of a particular discussion that needs to be, the clarity needs to be within a particular discussion that I'm carrying out, or somebody else is carrying out. You know, I'm using this to mean this, and make that very clear. Not in a very boring way. It might be clear in the way it's being used, so you don't have to stop the show and say, I'm going to define everything. But I'm trying to think about if I've noticed that reading across what I've been reading, which is strictly speaking within intersectionality, and then going back more broadly into Black feminism. And there are, for example, the whole notion of patriarchy. Is patriarchy as patriarchy being discussed when people talk about any kind of discrimination around, whether we call it sexism or we call it gender bias or whatever, and we could say those are different things. But you know, do I notice differences even within the literature I've been reading? And I think it's more about emphases and everything, and also terminology being used, but the fundamental idea of a discrimination or oppression occurring around a particular way of being, or a particular kind of instance of you are this, you know, so you know, you are a particular way, is enough, maybe, you know, kind of a working understanding of what we're talking about. But I don't think I'm really addressing what the specific case is being used. But if gender is used, can you say that again? Gender is used.
No, I suppose what Fiona seems to be referring to is the notion of gender. Maybe if you think of a second way of feminism, gender as a kind of as an oppressive, a tool of oppression, whereas gender is often used today as something to do with an inner feeling or something to aspire towards. So this kind of, what do people mean really when they're talking about gender, I suppose, is what Fiona is talking about, and whether or not we can be sure that when people use these terms that we're all they all have the same meaning for everybody.
Yeah. I think you'd have to, like I said at the beginning, I think maybe it's just the question of making clear what you're talking about. I mean, surely it would be that, because then we could get into issues of whether we're seeing these in terms of individual responses. So the whole thing of oppression is an individual enterprise, you know, enterprise, not the word, but an individual phenomenon. You know, it's happened to me, I respond in this way, or even my group, or whether we see a collective approach to these things. Personally, yeah.
Okay, I'm just going to, Haroon Mohammed's raised an issue that often comes up when people talk about intersectionality. And he says, does the value of your opinion depend on how many of these groups you belong to? For instance, the opinion of a Black woman who is also gay matters more than a white woman who is gay. Question, Is there a hierarchy? Is the straight white male at the bottom of this?
Well, that's something Patricia Hill Collins has actually written about explicitly, in saying it's not a matter of my oppressions are more than yours, or my oppressions are worse than yours. It is more, I think she would see it as more an issue of looking at what is the case that we're talking about. So just because, you know, do I have 5 oppressions and you have 3 is not a particularly productive way forward in any kind of discussion in a way. Having said that, to turn that around for somebody to, certainly it would seem licit to point out that if you are not a victim of racism, for example, and somebody else is, they at least would have a claim for saying, you know, you're not, you know, if you're not taking this into account in a kind of more broader analysis, you know, this is because possibly you've never suffered it, if you like. And this is a clear division, you know, one division that I mentioned earlier among the Communist Party in the United States, you know, the white communists not being sensitive to race issues, but also historically in the feminist movements, where a kind of white middle-class feminism has been dominant as what is more dominant in the media, if you like, as the face of feminism. And not, this is something that, you know, the Combahee River Collective and Angela and many other people I mentioned were fighting against in a ways. You're not taking into account, you're not taking into account Black women, and you're not taking into account particularly not taking into account Black working class women, if you like. So, so yes, it's not that it's more, it's just, I don't want to be too soft there, it's just different, but really it's about, you know, where is the discussion going, in fact, you know, if we get into that kind of comparison. Yeah.
Okay, there's an interesting question from Constant here, which is actually a question about language, which we haven't really talked about all that much. Yeah. Constant says, how far would you say CDA can be a bridge to intersectionality in applied linguistic studies?
Well, I think I didn't really do this today, but I probably, my instincts would be that my angle on this sort of thing could be from taking elements of CDA to discuss how this kind of, if we go back to the idea of the matrix of domination, you know, I like that term, even though I think it's problematic, but how this actually works in practice. And I say that because, particularly if we're looking at language, any language that's used, be it documents or be it something from the media or conversational data or whatever. So yes, you know, I think there would be a complements, but I'm trying to think, you know, I think I'm just, you know, one thing I mentioned earlier about whether intersectionality is being branded by people, that first it's become very trendy, I think, for a lot of people, and whether, that's why I said maybe the term is getting in the way in some cases, but the actual, the essences, if you like, you know, what's behind it and everything, there's a lot of very interesting stuff. So I'm wondering if some people, is anybody in CDA overtly using what might be termed an intersection, are they using intersectionality in the practice of CDA? I don't know. I'm trying to think if I've seen that, if anybody's got any ideas.
Does anybody want to unmute and say anything about that particular point?
Unmute.
Okay, I've got a question from Nick Moore. It's quite a long comment to do with, I suppose, the Marxist angle in all of this. Nick says, distinction is not discrimination or exploitation. It is not the social context that frames the value. Is it not the social context that frames the value assigned to distinctions? The most significant feature of the contemporary means of social reproduction, namely capitalism, benefits from discrimination of all kinds. This would place racism and sexism in the service of classism. Remove discrimination by class, and other forms of discrimination no longer function or make sense. This may sound reductionist and is not intended to ignore the lived experience of discrimination, but could a focus on sexism, racism, etc., detract from the most effective form of resistance to oppression by removing capitalist forms of social reproduction? Intersectionality allows us to categorize current experience, but does not help analyze the weight of discrimination or promote change. Is that too Marxist, he says?
Well, no, I think this is part of the debate where, on the one hand, I've got a couple of recent publications that were written by groups identifying themselves as Marxists who were just scathing about intersectionality, basically saying it's a distraction. The way it's being done, I might add, they're saying the way that a lot of people are using intersectionality, and they're, you know, talking about identity politics, you know, as kind of a negative term, and saying that, you know, this is a distraction from this basic element, capitalism, which is really the root of all problems, if you like. And so that seems to be a line of reasoning. I think it's interesting to go back to the Combahee River Collective, I keep going back to, but, you know, Beverly and Barbara Smith, you know, there's an interesting article written, there's an interview published, yeah, with both of them. And I can't remember which one, Beverly or Barbara, says, you know, she talks about class and she talks about being poor, growing up poor, and, you know, how being poor for her was always with her, and being Black was always with her, but not in the same way, and that whether she was encountering racism or not, but she always encountered poverty, right? But does that mean she thinks that, you know, that first we start with class issues and then work our way into racism and other things? Well, no, because the bit I reproduced from the Combahee River Collective statement, they talk about this thing that, you know, just the socialist revolution will not be enough. And the experience of this comes from the experience of all of these women, generations of them working. You know, we go back to the generation going a century ago who were in the Communist Party, and then more, you know, towards the end of the 19th century. But a common experience is this thing of in left-wing circles, I think, finding that there's not a sensitivity, where there might be a sensitivity to issues around what we might call feminism, there still is not enough sensitivity to the racial element. And in fact, people like Richard Wright, the author Richard Wright, the novelist, I mean, he was in the Communist Party for a brief period of time in the 1930s, and he went sort of the opposite. You know, he didn't become a hardcore right-winger by any means, you know, in that regard, but he did become very anti-communist because he just could not, he couldn't deal with the fact that none of the people he dealt with, none of the white communists he dealt with seemed to have any, you know, no idea about, you know, the sort of racism that somebody like he had encountered in his lifetime. So I think that the issue is always going to be is how you could work from a base. And I mentioned this thing of whether one kind of oppression or you know, whether there's one aspect of our lives of oppressive lives that is dominant. And if we did start with capitalism as the root, you know, we need to really go back. Yes, that's reductionist to an extent or to a great extent, you know, maybe, but, you know, you could start with that and say, look, this is where I'm starting from. But then the how capitalism has intersected with racism and well, just racism, let's say, because there is quite a bit on, you know, you have Cedric Robinson and various other scholars writing from a Black Marxist perspective and looking at the confluence of racism and capitalism historically, right? And that kind of literature is very suggestive. I don't agree with Cedric Robinson's take on Marxism in Black Marxism, but there are lots of very suggestive elements there and certainly a lot of workable material. And so it's a question of how you can bring these things together. But I think that there is this discourse that intersectionality is a distraction away from the chief matter at hand, which is looking at you know, global capitalism, as we might call it today, and the sort of the you know, what's going on, all of the negative effects of it, if you like, that everybody deals with, if you like. Again, I probably haven't answered the question, but I've drifted around. But I think that is obviously an interesting issue to bring up.
Can I just ask you a question? I mean, you said very clearly that intersectionality is not a theory of identity. And I think that's a very interesting thing to say. But when you look at the Combahee River Collective statement, I mean, which was my own personal entry into intersectionality, I mean, they make it very clear that statement comes out of what they say. I'm just looking at it here. It's embodied, they say, in the concept of identity politics, blah, blah, blah. It comes out of our own identity. I mean, how do you see identity as fitting in to?
Well, I think that's it. I mean, it is obviously you need some notion of having a racialized identity in order to talk about racism. So to say that as you just said, I mean, there's a base in identity, but it doesn't mean that it is the same as identity.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I think that's the thing. The reason why I put that in is because I think that's something I've been guilty of a little bit, if guilty is the word, on a couple of occasions, things I've written. And then I found that in other literature where there seemed to be a conflation that there's a difference between relationality and identity, you know, that all of these different dimensions of identity are interrelated and simultaneously in effect, if you like, and, you know, in our being in the world, you know, this sort of thing. But the other side, I think it's convenient. I mean, I was putting that up as kind of deliberately polemical to a certain extent, but, you know, just so baldly putting it, if you like. But I do think that there is an issue, and I have seen that line, and I don't know if it's Collins who's written that, but that more or less in those words, you know, let's be clear, intersectionality is not strictly speaking, we could even insert in there a theory of identity, right? Although obviously we need a theory of identity to be able to talk about those oppressions, you know, so. But it doesn't make it the same, you know, it doesn't make it the same. I think I was trying to emphasize that we need to have this idea of power and resistance in there, which maybe has been obvious to a lot of people from the beginning, but I think that there is a pulling of the concept in the direction of where it's just about a confluence of different identity dimensions.
Thanks, David. We've got about 10 minutes left, and I just realized that I've missed out one of the first questions that was asked from Andrew Goatley. Andrew wanted to know, I mean, given that intersectionality raises so many things more than, I suppose, race, gender, and class, or, you know, it's been expanded in many ways. How do you see the environment fitting into intersectionality, or an intersectional take on things?
Well, I think this is it's an interesting question, because I've been working again on, I mentioned the idea of structure, you know, structuring structures, or what actually structures our existence, and it's something I've written about in the past, and I've come back to it for this book I'm working on, as I mentioned, and I've included a kind of non-social realm in our lives, and one of the non-social elements would be environment, climate, and that sort of thing as a shaping structure in our lives, very obviously. So I think so from that point of view, it's there. Now, whether we could whether the environment could form, or let's take particular, are we talking about particular aspects of the environment? So we're talking about something like flooding or famine, no, sorry, flooding or hurricane, or, you know, some sort of natural disaster. So is that what we're talking about? Talking about global warming more generally, I'm assuming. So can we see that as an oppressive structure? And that's an interesting question, because I think we can, but I think intersectionality, that there is lurking in the background, whether it's made clear explicitly, there's an idea of human activity behind all of this, if you like, right? The oppression comes from human activity, or what lack of a better word. And so I haven't seen anything where that was brought in, but this would be an idea of going back to the notion of intersectionality as metaphor, and possibly stretching the metaphor, and also going back to the idea of elements that structure our lives and moving from just the social realm to something outside. I mean, another structuring element would be spatial matters, objects, that sort of thing. You know? So, you know, these are obviously our activity, who we are, everything is shaped by physical objects in the world and space and that sort of thing, how we move around. We're out in the city, you know, any kind of, you know, urban furniture, if you like, whatever. And also the climate, and these are not social things, even though they are interrelated with social activity. Because obviously, if you talk about anything like an object in a city, it was constructed at some point, if you like. And if you look at the environment, obviously, human activity is having a great effect on and has had in the past a great effect on the environment. So, so yeah, that's an interesting thing. I have to say, I haven't seen that mentioned, but it could be because that's maybe seen as maybe stretching the metaphor too far. I don't know.
Okay, I've got a question from Nathan Thomas, and he's asking really about some of your recent work in other areas. He says, I wonder how, or if or how, you incorporate concepts from intersectionality in your recently expanded view of positioning theory. I see some overlap, he says, especially with regard to the vectors of power view you've discussed today and the concept of gaze you added to positioning theory.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, I'm sorry I keep mentioning a book I'm writing, but I mean, I do have a chapter on where I look at positioning theories. So I'm sort of bringing forward some of the stuff I've been publishing lately and trying to advance on it. And I have had a plan to actually bring in this great big model where I'd have intersectionality. But as I said, I've decided to sort of excise. I have issues around power in there, and intersectionality could come into that briefly, but I'm not going to go like, you know. So yes, in terms of, you know, power and resistance being integrated into positioning theory, yes. And therefore, because intersectionality is, at least to my mind, a framework organized around notions of power and resistance, then so yes, you could make that link. How exactly? Well, that would take me a while to explain, and I'm not sure I could. I'm not sure I'm completely clear beyond what I've already written, as this person has mentioned. You know, like the Foucauldian gaze. Also, I will mention there's an interesting kind of Collins is engaged much more in her recent work with Foucault's work as well, and it's kind of interesting to see what she has to say about that. So there are some common elements in as far as notions of power, but some things that are not so much in common, I would say.
Okay. I think that's it in terms of comments in the chat, or I don't think there's anything else. We're nearly out of time. Does anybody else want to ask a final question? You just maybe unmute and ask the question if you want to.
Could I come back on the environmental issue?
Okay, go ahead, Andrew.
The problem with intersectionality and sexuality, as far as I'm concerned, and I put this in the chat, is to do with identity politics, of course, but the problem is that it's about dividing people into social groups and talking about the way different social groups are discriminated against or oppressed or whatever, and whether, you know, there's a confluence in intersectionality and that. The point about the environment is that the environmental movement, environmental CDA is about connectedness, you know, to rephrase what Hope Not Hate say, it's what we have in common, you know, we have more in common, you know, what connects us. And, you know, as a political campaigner out on the streets knocking on doors on behalf of Jeremy Corbyn rather than the Labour Party as it is now constituted, I tried to stress this environmental thing because I hate the idea that people can you know, divide us from each other, divide the different sections of oppressed people against each other. And I see the environmental movement as something which can stress what we have in common, what we share. We are actually all in this together. And so I see this as a rallying point for all sorts of different sections of society, just as classes, you know. I think class and the environment are the two things which affect the oppressed most. Mm-hmm. And that is why I think unless we're going to allow the oppressors to divide us and keep on conquering us, then we've got to unite around something. And, you know, I think identity politics, obviously, and some aspects of intersectionality are beside the point if we're going to bring about political change. That's all.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thanks, Andrew. David, do you want to comment on that, or?
No. I think I can, you know, I can see that point of view very clearly. And I think, for example, the you know, the COVID-19 pandemic has been a case of, to the extent we see this as environmental, and I think we can, as an environmental issue, that the way it's impacted on, it's impacted on the most exposed, which is not always the most oppressed and poor in society. So it's impacted on people in the political class because it's impacted on anybody who's been out there and who's been moving around. Mobility is a big issue here. But very obviously, looking in numbers, you know, sort of all of the numbers, it's impacted the most on the people who are most dispossessed, if you like, and the people who are in jobs who they have to work. And this has spilled over into, for example, debates about whether people from sort of Black people in the United States, for example, or people from Latinx backgrounds are the ones most affected. And numerically, that's the case, but what that's ignoring is the class issue. So very often I'm saying, so if a rich African-American stands up and says, I'm more at risk in this than somebody else who's white, then they would be saying that there's a biological argument here or something. I mean, I don't know what that means, but I have seen that sort of thing in the American press. And I think what it's ignoring is, because of the way the economic system is set up, more people from, more African Americans are in the types of jobs where they have to be out there, sort of low-level service jobs and this sort of thing. And that's a problem. And that's a confluence of capitalism and racism. It's existed historically in the United States. So I think we could, you know, I mean, I think the comment I just heard, okay, yeah, fine, I agree with that. But on the other hand, I don't think we need to write off these other battles. Can we not, you know, I think a lot of people would say, is there not a way to bring them together? But it could be, maybe it's taking on so many things at the same time. But I do see a confluence between the sort of effects of something like a pandemic with already existing matrix, you know, the already existing matrix of domination and oppression that exists, if you like. So I agree to an extent with the comment, but I would also say I think that people writing in intersectionality are not completely ignoring these things, and I'm not sure that all intersectionality research is sort of taking the tack that, you know, we have to divide people up into groups and, you know, everybody ends up separate, going about their ways, if you like. I think there's a broader approach of saying, you know, making, well, depends on which way you go, how revolutionary you are, making society better, or actually moving for real transformation, if you like. And that's where perhaps some divisions could be made between a more liberal approach and maybe a more left-wing approach, maybe.
All right, well, thanks, David. I think we're out of time, really, Jim, yeah? David, thank you for a very stimulating talk, and particularly for that historical perspective that I think would have been new to so many of us. Loads of comments saying, you know, thank you very much. I think we've all really enjoyed this. So thanks again, David, for your talk.
Thank you to everyone, because the comments and questions have been very helpful. Yeah, for me anyway. I'm sorry if my answers haven't been.
Not at all.
Thank you, everybody.
All right, stop the recording there.